Hello, welcome back to another video. This week, I finished a study despite encountering some challenges and rediscovered a supply I haven't used for a couple of weeks. Let's get into it. The supplies I used include Arch's hot press watercolor paper, Faber-Castell's 12 set of Polychromos pencils, Derwent Drawing Pencils in light Sienna and olive earth, as well as a 6 pencil red set, a white POSCA acrylic paint pen, a blending stump, and Daniel Smith's Watercolor Essentials set. I started by transferring the sketch onto the Arch's paper using my Polychromos pencils and a light box. I used to do this with a graphite pencil, but I like starting with colored lines, and the Polychromos don't dissolve underwater. Once the sketch and thumbnails were fully transferred, I started laying down the base colors with watercolor. I immediately started running into problems, beginning with the fact that my first wash was too dark. In the reference photo, the figure is mostly cast in shadow. The color I mixed was the right temperature, but too saturated and deep for a first layer, even when fully dry. I decided to soldier on despite this, and added a second layer over her body, as well as a first pass on the background. I wish I had taken a moment and tried to build form instead of just deepening everything, especially on her face. This would have saved me time in the dry media phase, but I guess hindsight is 20/20. When this layer was dry, I added the base layers to the tree trunks and branches in the background and the shadows in her hair. I tried to work on areas that didn't touch when possible to avoid accidental bleeding. I still wasn't satisfied with how the figure was coming out, so I turned my attention to the background instead. Even though all the leaves were green, they had different values and hues depending on the type of leaf and where it was in relation to the figure. I decided to make the foreground leaves cooler and more saturated, while the background faded into warmer olive tones. This next layer is when I started to doubt my ability to complete this study. I realized there wasn't going to be enough contrast to pick out the forms in her facial features because the preceding layers were too dark. I still tried to soften off the edges and build a little bit of volume, but it felt like too little too late. I persevered by trying to amp the contrast in other areas like her brows and hair. This helped frame the face a little and gave some life to the figure, but the underlying problems were still there. I decided to treat the watercolor as an underpainting at this point, which meant finesse was out of the window as I tried to focus more on values and texture in the background. Even though I wasn't thrilled with how the figure came out, I was happy with the variety of greens and browns I was able to capture in the background. As a split primary set, there are no convenience or single pigment greens in the Daniel Smith Essentials set, so all these colors had to be mixed. I'm glad I'm starting to get to know each of these colors better, and I hope in time this will transfer into quicker, more intuitive mixing. I'll be honest though, I was pretty disappointed with how this part came out. I think the largest issue was lack of value contrast, or clear value structure in general. Luckily, I had the tools to fix this moving forward. When everything was thoroughly dry, I untaped the study and placed it at an angle. I immediately started rendering the focal point, the face, with a combination of browns, reds, and white. I also added depth to the hair with chocolate brown and increased the contrast with orange and white. I usually use real-time clips, but I decided to keep a time-lapse version of this section to show the full extent of my struggles. The skin was too brown after the watercolor layers, which didn't match the red shadows I saw in the reference. The color pencils helped correct the hue, but unfortunately also obliterated any form I had managed to build. It isn't until the 40-minute mark in real time that these things start to turn around. This was the point where my brain finally stopped focusing on color and instead started looking for form. This change is most obvious in the face. Instead of layering color again and again, I started looking for shadows. Where was the dark versus the light, and what did that say about the underlying forms? By focusing my efforts on defining the eye sockets, jaw muscles beneath her lower lip, and high points like the bridge of the nose and cheekbones, the figure started coming back to life. Normally, I hit this point quicker, but it took an unusually long time this week. Part of me was frustrated by this, but it actually makes sense. I've been working with primarily line art right now, so my brain was thinking in lines instead of value. The reference also has subtle lighting on the face. there isn't a large value difference between the lights and darks here because her face is in shadow, but once I started seeing those differences, things started getting easier. Do I still wish I had flipped the switch from color/line to value in the brain sooner? Yeah, but sometimes you need to be patient with yourself. I understand why it took me that long and what to do going forward. Once the figure was around 95% done, I moved on to the background. Here, the colors weren't off, but there was still room to add texture and contrast. I'm constantly amazed by how opaque the Derwent Chinese white is after using Polychromos white for months. The Derwent pencil let me render clumps of leaves on top of dark trunks, and then glaze yellow and light green on top. A surprising color came in handy for rendering the trunks, light sienna. I normally use this peach tone for light skin or as skin highlights, but it was just the right lightness and color for the bright side of the tree trunks this time. For shadows, I use the Polychromos emerald green, walnut brown, and Derwent olive earth. At some point, I decided I needed a brighter highlight. The POSCA pen with its opaque ink was great at picking out the brightest highlights here. If you've been around, you'll recognize this pen as a staple for most of my studies. It hasn't been as essential since I started using pen ink and the Derwent Chinese white pencil, but I was reminded of why I love it this week. I can layer a pencil on top while still retaining the distinct look and texture of acrylic paint. This proved useful when rendering leaves and separating them from the smoother, more polished figure in the foreground. The closest leaves needed a different level of detail. In the photo, these are more in focus than the rest of the background since they occupy the same plane as the figure. I decided to add clearly defined edges to each leaf and to amp the contrast with true black and deeper green. My favorite part was breaking out the POSCA once again to paint in the brightest highlights along the tops of the leaves. It looks too bright at first, but soon blends into the rest of the foliage when I layer greens on top. Finally, it was time for the finishing details. For this study, that meant touching up her hair along the highlights, adding highlights to the eyes, and also darkening the lashes. Besides this, I also redefined her lips and added a subtle orange glow on the skin closest to the highlighted hair to imply warm light filtering through the strands. After that, it was finally done. This piece fought me most of the way, but I'm still glad I finished it in the end. I hope you enjoyed the video regardless, and as always, I hope you create something that brings you joy this week. I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!